Welcome to the Volpe Report podcast, the state's premier public affairs show dedicated to the topics that matter most to Pennsylvanians. I'm your host, Chuck Volpe. Join us now as we speak to this week's guest.
The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is brought to you by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
We want to welcome all of you back to the 12th year of the Volpe Report. I hope you had a wonderful holiday, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. But the world keeps spinning, time keeps moving, and we are here now to start, believe it or not, our 12th year. It seems like yesterday getting ready to launch this show at the end of 2013. I was then serving as the chairman of the Lackawanna County Government Commission, charged with examining the form of government in Lackawanna County. A short time later, we did our first show with then starting quarterback of the Oakland Raiders and former Penn State star, Matt McGloin. How ironic that 12 years later, Matt has actually become a county commissioner in Lackawanna County, and the voters decided to keep the commissioner form of government, despite my best efforts to change it. Well, enough of the trip down memory lane. We start our 12th year with our very own United States Congressman Dan Meuser, who has become an important figure nationally. Dan is one of only a handful of congressmen who has a personal relationship with the 47th president. Dan talks to President Trump personally a couple of times every week. I was in Washington with my wife on Friday, January 3rd, for the 119th Congress's Inauguration Day, when 435 United States representatives and 100 United States senators were sworn in. My wife and I were extended the honor of attending the swearing-in of our new United States Senator, Dave McCormick. This was a private affair for friends and family and a handful of key supporters, waiting in an anteroom outside the Senate chambers, as the senators were called in alphabetically to take the oath of office. Ironically, the ceremony was conducted by the President of the Senate, who is constitutionally designated to be the Vice President of the United States, one Kamala Harris. Dave came into the anteroom we were waiting in after he was sworn in and made some remarks to us when he became officially our senator, and was then whisked off to begin performing his duties. While this was going on the other side of the Capitol, today's guest, Representative Dan Meuser, was doing some old-fashioned arm twisting and horse trading to ensure that Speaker Mike Johnson's reelection to the speakership would be accomplished on the first ballot. It was very important for the Republicans to be able to show that the party was united and avoid the fiasco of 2 years ago when former Speaker Kevin McCarthy took 3 days and 15 votes to finally be elected Speaker. On today's show, which will be part one of 2 shows, we will discuss some of Dan's role behind the scenes, as well as the aggressive legislative agenda they have set in the House, as well as what he expects in the first 100 days from President Trump, as Dan attended this past week's inauguration. Dan will also be coming back next week on part 2 to discuss, among other things, what he saw, of course, at the inauguration, as well as his potential run for governor of Pennsylvania.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Congressman Dan Meuser, welcome to the inaugural show after I took my winter siesta. Welcome to the inaugural show of the Volpe Report, and there is no better guest. I know I'm supposed to be neutral on this show, but I'm going to say my favorite guest. Of all my guests, I'm looking at a good friend beside everything else, a person I'm very proud to say I'm a major sponsor of and supporter of in all things. And there would be no one better to have on our show. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Chuck. And there's no better friend than you. I appreciate it. You have a great show, an inaugural show, as we're about to have a big, beautiful inauguration down here in D.C.
I use that word on purpose to kind of set it up. And I have to say, all kidding aside, that I've interviewed you in studio many, many, many times. I've interviewed you in New York City many times. I've interviewed you by Zoom like this as you were doing your job in the United States Capitol a number of times. But you are clearly moving up in the world, in your power structure in the House, because I've never seen such a beautiful backdrop. You have the Capitol, you have winter Washington, you have the white barren trees with snow on it sitting behind you in kind of a white backdrop. So anybody that wondered about your star being on the rise would have no doubt, based on this could be the best backdrop I've had of any guest. That includes Kevin McCarthy. That includes like Bobby Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard. I don't know. Tulsi Gabbard had a pretty good background, like New York City skyline, I think she had. So let me talk about, since this is my first show, and I've already done the open and kind of told our some background for our guests and our viewers. I spent the inaugural weekend in Washington, the swearing in of the United States senators, United States congressmen. Of course, you being foremost on my list. I was happy to spend part of that day with you and in your office. Of course, in the morning, I was invited by our new United States Senator to attend his private swearing-in part ceremony. So I was with Dave McCormick in the morning. So at any rate, it was a wonderful day. I got to spend a lot of it. And of course, we capped the night off at the big celebration at the Waldorf in the President's Ballroom with our new Senator Dave McCormick and you and your staff and politicians from all over Pennsylvania. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and get into the first part of this. When I was, after your swearing in, and I got to spend some time in your office party, as all the congressmen have after they're swearing in, I was sitting in the back room with you and a few key people, and you were telling a story, and I think it'd be interesting. We try not to do too much, like college political science and civics on this show, but once in a while it's appropriate. You were kind of regaling all of us with some stories of the role you played behind the scenes. And what I mean by that is people are vaguely aware, people that don't pay attention as much as we do, for example, that there was some issue coming into January 3rd if Mike Johnson would be reelected as the United States Speaker of the House of Representatives. Of course, he had the important endorsement of President-elect Trump. And it appeared to me, at least, a lot of pundits as a fait accompli, but it was anything but that. Going into that, there was debt ceiling issues that had to be raised and deals that had to be done, ending the old term as of December 31st in the last Congress, before the 119th Congress was sworn in. So with all that as background, it was not a lock by any stretch of the imagination, although you were one of the key people in those backroom negotiations. I'm proud to say, as a Republican, you got it done on the first ballot. But take us in behind the scenes as much as you can, not divulging private matters, but what you can talk about in the role you played with recalcitrant members, basically.
Well, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, it was certainly an interesting day. It tends to always be interesting here. We thought we were going to lose at least one member to not voting for Mike Johnson on January 3rd, as you mentioned. We needed to swear in the speaker before any new members could be sworn in. However, they do have a vote as members-elect for the speaker itself. So the new members, before they were sworn in, were able to vote for the speaker. So all of the new members and 99+% of the House membership, of course, voted for Mike Johnson, myself included. We knew there was going to be one a member that wasn't, and he stayed that way. He telegraphed that well in advance. And frankly, I have a lot of respect for him. His name's Thomas Massey, and why he wasn't going to vote that way. But we only could lose one more. Actually, we couldn't even lose one more. It had to be a present vote at very worst, unless there were less Democrats that showed, and they were all there, and they all voted for their candidate,
Hakeem Jeffries,
Minority Leader Jeffries. So anyway, to make probably a long story short, President Trump did give the endorsement of Mike Johnson a few days or maybe a week prior to the vote. And frankly, that made a big difference to many members. And one thing that some of the members I had to remind along the way, we were voting for the future here. We really weren't voting for the past, because I will say when Mike Johnson came in, and many in Pennsylvania have met him. We've had him up several times, very articulate, very smart, great patriot, fiscal conservative, practical minded, knows the job, very good at the job. But then we had a couple of members that voice voted for, by name, another member. So we were in a little bit of a logjam there. And all I did was speak to both of them, and I just reminded them, reinforced that we are now voting for the future. We're not voting for the past, because there were some controversial decisions made that I agree with. I was not very happy with some of the negotiations and decisions that took place. But I informed them that Mike Johnson, Speaker Johnson, will not be negotiating with Chuck Schumer anymore. He'll be negotiating with John Thune, who's a fantastic guy and who's a really good friend of Dave McCormick's. And he was up several times into Pennsylvania. So, and he's a fiscal conservative. He's practical. He's the right person as the majority leader now of the Senate. And then, of course, we had President Trump weighing in. And look, President Trump got elected by 77 million votes, more than the entirety of the House, by 3 million more. Call it a mandate, call it whatever we want. All we know is that the country wants a correct course, and President Trump has a plan. And it's a plan to strengthen America, strengthen our economy, strengthen our national security, bring world stability, and bring in more fiscal sanity to the level of spending that takes place with DOGE and everything else. So that's what we're voting for. We're voting for the trifecta. We're voting for a partnership, a team led by the White House, led by President Trump. And that's the discussions I had with a couple of members, and it sank in. But I will just say this, as I was done with them, and they were sort of nodding a little bit, a call came in from the future 47th president, and I think that put them over the top.
No, there's no doubt. And one of the things I want to point out, I've been sitting and watching politics, Dan, as I know you're aware. My viewers are probably vaguely aware, really my whole life. I've told many people I've got a PhD in it. I've run for governor of Pennsylvania. I've spent the money to run a governor's race. I've been involved in politics at fairly high levels. So, like when I say I know how, I do know how. And as you know, once the name goes on the ballot, then you know how. I always loved the story from the great old speaker Sam Rayburn with his Texas buddy Lyndon Johnson at the John F. Kennedy celebration after they swore in the cabinet. They had a little cocktail party for all the cabinet designate secretaries. And Lyndon Johnson was extolling to his friend Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson was now vice president, about how John Kennedy had bought the best and the brightest. Harvard, Yale, head of Ford Motor Company, wow. And good old Sam Rayburn looked over his shoulder and he said to him, Lyndon, they may be just as wonderful as you say, but I'd feel a heck of a lot better for the country if just one of them had run for sheriff. And the message was spot on. That was my point to you. So we both had our name on the ballots. So let me say this, that watching you work and now having you explain to folks behind the scenes, I just want to have a shout out to you of how impressed you continue to impress me and our viewers. Your role that you've grown into as a congressman in 8 years. You've already been a Secretary of Revenue for Pennsylvania, but this is a whole nother animal, and your leadership skills are on display, which later on in this show, actually it may fall in part two because this is a two-part show, will serve you well on a path you're thinking about taking, because you're demonstrating the leadership, executive decision-making, deal-making that has to go on. So we'll save that part for later, but I want to applaud your efforts on behalf of the country, really, and our neck of the woods up here, because I can tell you I was at that private ceremony with Dave McCormick, and there was some, despite the fantastic, excitement, exhilaration of swearing in is a big thing, but there was a little sense of foreboding in the room that day because they didn't know what was going to happen over in the House. And for all the wonder of all those now a 53-47 mandate of Republican majority in the Senate, as you mentioned, Senator John Thune, they were saying almost like, don't muck this up over in the House. Like, we don't need 15 ballots. We don't need to send that message and then have the Democrats crowing about, look, they can't even get their own house in order. That would not be what President Trump needed to start his second administration. So thank you. by the way.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And you're right. We were not going to trip out of the gate. So that was also extremely important. And the president knows these things, and he knows when to weigh in and when not to. He's got a great feel for it. And that comes from all the interaction that he does have with members and certainly, as you mentioned, with myself. And, and that's why come January 20th at noon during the swearing in, boy, everybody better buckle up their seatbelts because we've got some plans. We've got a 100-day plan. You always hear that, but this one's going to be accomplished, or we're gonna, I'm not gonna say die trying because we're not gonna die. We're gonna accomplish and we're gonna live, and we're gonna correct the course of this country. We are going to pass in reconciliation some really important bills. We are going to secure the border. We are going to deport in an algorithmic manner the worst of the illegals that are here, those that were here for that have committed crimes. We just passed a bill today in the House, the Lake and Riley bill, that calls for anyone who commits any sort of crime, for that matter, certainly violent crime, can get contacted by ICE and will in fact be deported. So there's a lot of talk in the Senate. We think we'll even get Democrats on board. We should, for crying out loud, to pass that bill. But these are the things: border, strengthening our economy, keeping the small business taxes and the family taxes low, perhaps even lower, protecting our manufacturing. China continues to overwhelm the world with its production capacity, and we're frankly letting it happen. We need to be more competitive, and we need to maintain the level. You hear about the tariffs. China's got stiff tariffs on us. We've got some tariffs on them, but not as significant. That's not fair trade. President Trump is about fair trade. President Trump has reintroduced, he's made everyone rethink how tariffs, frankly, work. So many want to go back to 50, 80, 100 years ago, how tariffs, frankly, had a lot to do with was causing the Great Depression. It's not that case any longer. We're allowing others to manufacture really important goods that should be made and can be made in the United States by American hands, made in the USA, because we're allowing them to be that much more competitive. And yet, and Chuck, you know this, of course, everybody knows this. Our wages are higher, our health care is higher, our pollutant controls are higher, our pension plans are better. I mean, we have all these added costs on businesses. Why in the world would we also be giving countries like China, Vietnam, Mexico, for that matter? They're close, so that is a little bit more of a friendly situation. Advantages when it comes to tariffs as well. Trump's not going to stand for it. And just think of this, now that I'm on this tariff point, why would we increase taxes on domestic production before we would put taxes, which is what a tariff basically is, on products being imported, particularly from an adversary like China? Okay, it's not logical. We're going to bring logic to trade. The fact that our country was heading in the wrong direction in our economy, on our manufacturing, on our national security, world stability going to hell, right? I mean, no more than between Russia, the Middle East, I mean, Africa, the relationships in China, it's just been terrible. We're going to have a plan and execute that plan, and we're going to accomplish. And a lot of this will be accomplished within the first 100 days. And that's why certainly it is very important that Republicans stick together, because we don't expect a tremendous amount of Democrat support, although many of them are starting to see the light, if you will, see the truth for what it is, because most of America is seeing what is right, what is truthful, what is reality, what we need to do. We cannot have an assault on American energy and expect to have low gasoline prices. We will have inflation when they do things like that. We can't have wildly excessive spending and not expect inflation, and not to mention the instability that it creates for our financial markets and our country's fiscal solvency. So there are some Democrats coming around. And that's why, as I said, our 100 days, this budget reconciliation, we're going to have competitive tax rates. We're going to be reducing spending. We're going to secure the border. We're going to have energy policy. and more and more. Oh, and regulations are at the top of my list as well. Two, we'll have additionally better access to capital. We're going to be calling off the dog. You know, I'm on the Financial Services Committee,
Of course.
and now I'm a subcommittee chair. The SEC, the FDIC went rogue over the last 4 years. And I've got plenty of examples as to what that means. Well, we're pulling that back. We're going to have safeguards, of course, in place, yet we're going to allow capital formation to be maximized, companies going public to be easier done, and we will allow community banks to serve small businesses far better than they did before.
Well, that's great, Dan. You know, as you were talking there, a bunch of things popped in that I think I'd like your comment on. You talked about the energy issues and the woke progressive onslaught by the radical progressive Democrats, including Democratic governors all over this country. And of course, we're all aware and saddened and heartbroken over the tragedy befalling the citizens of California with the raging fires, the homelessness, the deaths it's caused, the destruction. It looks like 4 nuclear bombs were dropped in and around Southern California. It's tragic. Having said that, you know, there has been a little political sideshow, as you're aware, developed between President Trump and Governor Gavin Newsom. And the sideshow is they're doing their best to evade responsibility, meaning Gavin Newsom, for his participation and contribution to that. And of course, then, oh, how could you pile on in this time of need? And President Trump just called it right. And I'm going to do the same on this show and ask for your comment. Here's the reality, and he's now being called out on it. They apparently have, in this Green New Deal that everybody's embracing, no drilling, no fracking, killing off fossil fuels, everything electric. You remember last summer, twice their whole grid dropped in California. They told people they couldn't charge their electric vehicles like only certain hours a day. What a travesty. But what I didn't know, Dan, and I know you now know, and now most of America knows, I'm shocked and appalled. Part of his Green New Deal in California, they've been diverting water from that flows into California. Instead of trapping them in reservoirs and dams, because God knows this isn't the first brush fire they've had out of control in California, they diverted all that water because there's a smelt species that could have been endangered. So apparently, again, that's the Democratic progressive. And, you know, smelts are more important than human beings, apparently. And then people are saying, well, now's not the time. No, now is the time. You had fire hydrants that had no water in them. And President Trump said this was simple. It was dumb what he did. So this gets back to what you're talking about, the dumb, progressive, draconian Green New Deals that make Americans suffer and pay more money, drives inflation for this green utopia that's a false, that doesn't exist. How about protecting your citizens? But I want your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll tell you something. Leadership matters. The positions of being elected officials, the responsibilities that they have matter. The mayor of Los Angeles, I know her, Karen Bass, who's a fine member. Right. She's over there. I think she's just occupying a seat. They're not performing. They have no plan.
She went to Ghana. She went to Africa.
Right. Spending taxpayer dollars, I'm sure.
Instead of being there in the fire.
That she'll owe favors to. Yeah. Right. Gavin Newsom is a terrible leader, terrible governor. Now let's compare him to Ron DeSantis, your friend. Let's compare him to, I'm going back a little bit, Mitch Daniels, Mike Pence, Governor Braun.
Governor Abbott.
I'm going to bring up Abbott, but Indiana is a flourishing state where businesses are flocking to. And they're making it exciting, improving quality of life. It's very safe. It's becoming a central point for AI, for crying out loud. So Governor Abbott in Texas, I mean, their GDP is through the roof. Guess where Pennsylvania's is, for instance? It's less. It's 1/3, 1/4 of what the type of growth that Texas has. Texas is flat. You spent a lot of time there. It's hotter than hell, and then it's cold. But Pennsylvania is beautiful. And
Mountains.
Mountains, our position in the geographic position to the population. We should be the ones at the top of the list. And it all comes down to leadership. It comes down to a plan. It comes down to the ability to execute that plan. And yes, first it requires vision, but it requires a lot of work. Your friend, Ron DeSantis, what he has done in Florida is nothing short of phenomenal. Now, he had some good governor, Rick Scott, before him. If the common denominator seems to be to make a state great is to have two good governors in a row in particular. Florida used to be 10, 12 years ago, like number 37, number 38, as far as public education goes. You know where it is right now? Number 2, if not number 1. Number 2. And guess who? Guess what state is 37, 38? Pennsylvania. Wow. Yeah. So, but on a federal level.
The teachers' unions might have, the PSCA may have something to do with that, but go ahead.
Oh, right. So what President Trump is doing on the national stage, he's getting very serious, and he's going to have a real sense of urgency. We are going to be super competitive with our economy and with our businesses. We are going to not protect, but at least put our manufacturing on a fair playing field. So not only we can flourish here at home and bring down costs here and deliver more, because supply side economics, by the way, the more we increase supply to meet demand, that's what reduces inflation. That's what eliminates inflation. That's what we need to do, and make our goods and services more competitive overseas. So China's not selling everywhere, and we are selling everywhere, and we make better products as well. So these are the things that can be done. National security is energy dominance, right? Border security. Give me a break. We're spending over $400 billion on paying for illegal immigrants' hotels and phones and travel and border patrol that do nothing but process and resettle. They're not protecting the border. They're helping people come in because that's what the Biden administration has required them to do. None of this makes any sense. And fortunately, come January 20th, we're going to have a common sense president. Yeah. And I will tell you this, as I was mentioning, my fear is that Pennsylvania gets left behind because we need common sense and I'll even say conservative planning, serious planning to make our city safe, to improve our quality of life, to bring in businesses, to create prosperity.
Well, Dan, on that note, because that was eloquent and well done, we'll take this opportunity to break on part 1 and then come back on a couple of other things and as a tease, as a promotion, talk about your name has been prominently mentioned as a gubernatorial candidate, Republican candidate to challenge Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. Look, the way you've spoken and your command of issues and your executive aptitude, we'll say, and talents have been on full display in the past half hour. We'll take a break and come back. We have a few other matters to talk about relative to the inauguration coming up. Actually, when this show airs, it'll have passed. We'll talk about that, and then I want to go right into Governor Dan Meuser. Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Volpe Report podcast. Be sure to visit our YouTube and Facebook pages for upcoming episodes. You can catch up on the Volpe Report podcast on your favorite podcast provider.